the Fortune 500 companies have signed on to real measurable climate commitments. And so I think, the interest in carbon markets is really sort of an artifact of the excitement and momentum around doing something about climate change. I saw a funny tweet the other day that was, reframing climate change as just a series of regionalized apocalypses, right? And so, if we need to rebrand it, as in a way that mobilizes our society to do it, then that's fine. And I think that people now, really since Paris, the climate accord, have really started to think more strategically about what do we do about it. And a lot of people have pointed to these market, mechanisms to do it. And our carbon market is a great opportunity for us to use a tool that's already in place, that already exists, to make a real impact and support an industry or a variety of different industries like agriculture in a way that can be positive for everyone.
That's a really good point. And on the slide here that we've got showing, this isn't just something that's being compelled by governments, saying certain industries or certain companies must conform with this regulation or with that particular goal. But we're seeing an amazing increase in the volume of household name companies who are coming out and saying, we're pledging to be net zero. We're pledging to be carbon neutral. We're pledging to be, climate positive by such and such a date. There's a renewed focus voluntarily by big organizations and individuals as well, that they don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for government to tell us what to do in order to make a positive impact on climate.
Completely agree. Yeah. I mean, again, and it is becoming less of a political issue as well. I think that there's a recognition across, the entire political spectrum that we need to do something about this, and doing so in a voluntary capacity, in a way that mobilizes the private sector alongside, individuals and the government to come together and find a practical solution is very inspiring.
It really is. And, what's interesting, what's interesting there is that when it comes to, the politics of it, of course, here in the United States, just a couple of days ago, the U.S. Senate passed the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It was overwhelming bipartisan support, not just kind of narrow margins, but, something I think 93 or 96% of all of the senators voting for it. It still hasn't passed the House yet, but just overwhelming bipartisan support. And when we come to regenerative agriculture, it's regenerative agriculture, which of course is core to the SIBO Technologies mission. But regenerative agriculture has a very big and profound impact on carbon farming, on carbon markets, on carbon credits, and on soil regeneration and replenishment. So this is one of the areas, I think, where we are helping, we're aligning the values and the needs of American farmers with the values and needs of organizations who are, have carbon and climate commitments, with kind of the overall values and needs to make a positive impact when it comes to climate change. I often say, people are hard pressed to find, a farmer who they don't like. I mean, who doesn't like farmers and farming and helping, people produce better soils, better food that our food eats, and a healthier population. It's one of these things where it just makes sense across the board, without having to wield kind of a big regulatory stick in order to get compliance. So.
That's right. I mean, I think regenerative agriculture is one of those things that, we talk about as having, co-benefits or stacked co-benefits, right? So yes, it is a climate solution. Yes, we can sequester carbon in the soil, and that carbon happens to make agricultural land more productive and healthier and more resilient. But there's all these other benefits of it as well. things like biodiversity or providing another revenue stream to growers who are already operating on thin margins. I mean, if we can find a solution like regenerative agriculture that is inspiring on so many levels, then it just makes practical sense for something that we should pursue. It's not easy, and we'll talk more about why that is, but it is important for us to figure out.
Well, let's dive into some of that demystification. Let's talk a little bit about carbon markets. And so for the next couple minutes, let's work to demystify what carbon markets are all about. There's well, we have a slide here. Why don't I bring those back up, kind of as a guide for us to talk. Really, there's compliance markets, right? And then there's voluntary carbon markets. Do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between those two, or how are they, or what they work on, and we can riff on there?
Sure. I mean, I think that the primary thing to understand is just that a compliance market is a regulated market. It is required for those that are under that guidance to participate. There's no choice about it. And that can mean a bunch of different things. There could be price guidance. There could be standardization that is defined specifically by the governing body. But then the other side of that is a voluntary market, right? So this is kind of the space that we're in right now within agriculture in the United States. It's not regulated. It's not enforced, and it's still early days. So those that are purchasing these credits to offset their own greenhouse gas footprint are doing so in a voluntary capacity, either because they care very much about this space, they care about their impact on climate, or they see the writing on the wall that at some point in the future this could become a regulated compliance market. So that's kind of where we are right now. Again, and voluntary markets sometimes have a way of becoming regulatory markets in the future.
Right. And when we think about kind of the difference between regulatory markets and institutional compliance markets, I think that notion of the of the big stick of regulation, kind of requiring that an industry or a company do some things in order to offset their carbon footprint, is important, right? We just saw the Dutch court rule. I believe it was I think it was just within the last month against ExxonMobil, saying that they have to step up some of their efforts there, and so that's an example of an international regulation on a foreign company. But it was also a kind of a bellwether for a lot of the other companies in that industry sector. But when we come to voluntary or private voluntary markets, we can talk about a lot of the startup works. It's the space that SIBO Technologies is in. It's a lot of the space that a lot of the other carbon farming platforms and technology markets are in. No one is coming out and saying you must buy carbon credits or carbon offsets from regenerative ag, at least not yet. And there's a perception, I think, that voluntary carbon markets are complex or are difficult to understand. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, how voluntary carbon markets, as especially for voluntary ag carbon markets, are kind of leading the way to make things simple?
Yeah, I think, and one of the challenges here I just point out is that, part of the reason that they're complex is because there's very little guidance right now. And there's a lot of different players with, mixed, sometimes overlapping messages around, the way that things should work, or, the way that they've built out their methodologies. And because of that, I think it creates quite a bit of confusion, right? right? So, within the context of a voluntary carbon market, we have, at this point, players out there that are sort of making their own definitions and coming to market with, credits that they deem to be, credible. And then there are platforms or entities out there, NGOs, that specifically focus on facilitating this. So, there are registries, Vera, Gold Standard, Climate Action Reserve, or CAR. They all do this. They create standards or protocols that are designed to help sort of, demystify and ensure that, the credits that are being transacted are credible and they're valid, and that they've undergone a sufficient amount of rigor and oversight so that, people aren't getting boondoggled and purchasing something that's not real. And I think that's incredibly important to exist. And because of that, because that we really need to define how valid these credits are and prove it. In some cases, it's overly rigorous. And I think that, the position we're in within agriculture right now is that, our desire to ensure that these credits are valid is actually preventing, in some ways, the market from fully taking off right now. And so, as we sort of move into a space where perhaps there's more regulation or there's more, government mandated structure or definition, that will help, I think, in some ways, to find what will be acceptable in a way that doesn't, prevent participation from many of the growers that would like to participate in these markets.
Right, and I think that's an important point that you make there. Right, the first is to to really understand that there's a gradient or a variation in there's a continuum of what a carbon credit is based on its verification and where it comes from and how long it's how much carbon and how long that carbon is represented to stay kind of in place where where it's being sequestered, or how much is being avoided permanently, that sort of thing. And there's a number of these organizations and programs and protocols that are coming out saying, we've got a way to do it, or we've got a way to do it. And there's not, a kind of a 2 + 2 = 4 consensus around, this is good and that's bad. I think everybody agrees we ought to be doing something, and there's different ways of measuring that and identifying it. In fact, that's what our webinar at the end of July will be covering, is kind of looking at the landscape of all of those different carbon programs and protocols. Mm-hmm. And when it comes into that voluntary carbon marketplace, spurring participation and making it easy for people to engage both on the supply side, and in our case, farmers and growing operations, and on the demand side, whether that's individuals or businesses who want to buy carbon or regenerative ag units or offsets or insets. They want to make a transaction. That has to be easy. Because at the end of the day, as a society, we're used to buying and selling things in a very easy and efficient manner, right? Amazon has made that very popular and easy for us. We've been conditioned to make that, to make those transactions easy. And the sign up and the growing process has to be easy as well, and cost effective.
Right. I would just add, Billy, that we're in a place right now within the ag-based carbon markets. It's still very new, right? And there is a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of how long soil carbon is sequestered in the ground and what sort of things can release it, and what sort of practices we need to require to ensure that we're warehousing enough carbon to actually have a real tangible impact on climate. The protocols related to agricultural carbon on Vera and CAR were released within the past year. And at this point, there are still very, very few projects that have been accepted to allow for credit generation within them. And so, we're still at a point right now where we're defining what is an acceptable level of uncertainty as it relates to that the soil carbon and sort of the impacts there. And so while we're defining that, it makes it challenging, I think, to truly incentivize growers to take on these practices when it's a little bit of a moving target in terms of what they can earn and whether they're going to be able to recoup their investment.
That's a really good point, and it speaks to one of the questions that has come through So thank you very much. For those of you who are watching live, please do type your questions into the question box, and as they come up and are relevant to the topic that Stephen is discussing, we'll address them here. And I think this is time to talk a little bit in more detail about Vera and CAR. The question that came through is, how are Vera and CAR regulated? How do we know that their reporting is accurate and that there's no conflict of interest? You care to comment a little bit about that, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, they are not regulated. So there's no governing body. I mean, they're acting in a sense as the regulators within an unregulated marketplace. And so, they need to establish credibility within this space. And largely they've done that by hiring experts and by working with, those who really understand the space to develop, the protocols and methodologies required to generate carbon credits. So, I think it's important. It's an interesting question. I mean, there's no, if this were a compliance market, there would be some regulation that would, help define that. As of now, I don't know of anything beyond, their own credibility being on the line to ensure that, they're doing things efficaciously.
Well, and at the end of the day, right, it's all based on science. And so the science is repeatable, the science is testable, the scientific methodologies they're not hidden, it's not a black box. And you have a growing consensus, an already massive and growing consensus of global scientists who are implementing the formula and the methodologies and the testing criteria and the different protocols to actually say, yep, no, this actually does work. And it's a matter, I think, at this point of, it's not about, is there a conflict of interest in place, or is there fraud in place, but more about, is one going to be better than the other? And I think that's a great place to be in, because that means we're always going to have incremental improvement, just like we do in other market spaces, right? In technology markets, right? We're not still sticking at the first generation iPhone. We're on to 12. Because there's constant innovation. And guess what? It's not just Apple with an iPhone, it's also Samsung and Google and all of the other technology makers there. So there's that incremental improvement, which I think it's a good place to be. And the science is able to be reproduced by anybody who's interested. And it's certainly the approach that we've taken here at SIBO Technologies with our own highly qualified, group of scientists that run from climate scientists to crop modelers to soil scientists and all of the above. So it's not a matter of opinion or philosophy or conjecture as much as testing rigor and always looking for the next best methodology.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, and this is going to be an iterative process, right? And I think we expect to see changes within those protocols as they develop. Again, this is the first sort of go at trying to do this, and so we need to determine, what needs to change moving forward in order to unlock these markets. But by and large, I think that what's been put out there so far is really great stuff.
Yeah. Any comments on gold standard? Another question from a viewer right now, and again, I'll remind our viewers, whether you're viewing now or watching this on demand, that we do have another webinar planned right now for the end of July, where we will go into depth on all of the different programs and protocols. We mentioned Vera, we mentioned CAR. Any comments on gold standard?
Gold standard is sort of the third in the big three, as I like to call them. Gold standard has a very, very high standard, in terms of the way that they view these markets. And I think that, as it relates to offsets within agriculture, they've taken a little bit more of a wait and see approach because of some of that uncertainty that I was referring to earlier. And so CAR and Vera have sort of released their protocols, and, Vera calls it the, VM42, and CAR is the, soil and land enrichment protocol. And I think that when you look at Gold Standard, they've taken a slightly different approach in that they're looking more heavily at sort of scope 3 programs, so things that are more focused on supply chain, emissions reduction and mitigation, and defining more protocols and regulations there, which I think is also very important and something that SIBO is looking very closely at.
Well, why don't we take some time to turn now to our next topic. We've done a little bit of an overview of carbon markets. We've talked about there are institutional compliance markets, which are governed by regulation and have some compulsory capabilities or feeders into them. And then the private voluntary markets like SIBO Technologies and like a lot of the ag-based carbon markets right now, where you can voluntarily enroll, you can voluntarily purchase a carbon credit or an emissions reduction unit, and they are real and they are really offsetting or counting for a certain amount of carbon that has been sequestered, but they don't have the compulsory nature of the compliance markets, and so you can feel good that the science is solid, but you can't necessarily use it to answer a judgment from The Hague. We talked a little bit about those compliance markets and the voluntary markets. Let's turn our attention now to understanding, what is a carbon credit? What is that thing that we loosely call a carbon credit? And maybe Stephen, you could talk a little bit about how there are some different names for carbon credits or
sure,
emissions units and things like that.
Yeah, so I would just start by saying that typically a carbon credit is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon or carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2 equivalent. And the idea is that ton is not being emitted into the atmosphere, and so this represents sort of the reduction or avoidance of carbon that would have otherwise been emitted. We'll come back to this slide, but I think it's important to sort of define how there's a lot of conversation around offsets and insets, and how they're different from one another. I think when we're thinking about offsets, I think the first thing to point out is that typically an offset is defined by an emissions reduction credit that's generated kind of by a project developer, and then it's sold separately, almost as a permission structure to pollute to someone else. Okay, so you can think of like a big tech company who has lots of emissions associated with their servers, and they could be purchasing offsets from a completely different industry to offset the pollution that they've emitted, and that could be either that they've chosen to emit or that are completely unavoidable as part of their operations. And so the idea there is that an offset would allow for an organization that is polluting to essentially write off that pollution because of a purchase of an offset elsewhere. And I like to point out again that it is in some ways a permission structure to pollute, because we're just agreeing that it is acceptable for that pollution to go into the atmosphere. Doesn't mean that offsets aren't great and that they serve an important purpose. But Bill, you and I were talking a little bit about sort of the bathtub analogy earlier, and I think it's a useful one in terms of how we should be prioritizing our efforts around reducing emissions. Do you want to give that example?
Yeah, that was it was a part of an article that we had been reading just a little bit earlier today, and the analogy goes something like this, right? If your bathtub in your house is overflowing, it makes sense to both turn off the spigot as well as get a sponge. And applying that metaphor to carbon credits and carbon markets, right? A carbon offset is the sponge, right? You're literally taking something outside to soak up the overflow. And the insetting activity, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the pollution that you're emitting through changing of processes. That's equivalent to turning off the spigot, stopping the processes that cause the pollution or reducing them. And contrary to this gets to be a kind of somewhat of a contentious debate sometimes when people say, well, you should turn off the overflow, and other people say, no, we need the sponges. And the real answer, I think, is, well, it's both. If you're in a situation in your bathroom and your bathtub is overflowing, yes, turn off the spigot and make sure that you've got the sponge. You've got to do both things. And if for whatever reason you can't turn off that faucet, if the water is going to continue to overflow, maybe there's a pipe burst there, or you can only get it so much and it's going to keep on leaking, you do the best you can until you can overhaul the entire system. And meanwhile, you get the sponges and you clean and you keep on soaking up that overflow.
Right.
So there's a really important lesson here. We're people who are and organizations who are maybe vested in one approach or the other, maybe lose sight, maybe lose the forest for the trees, or the ears of corn for the fields of corn in our world. But it's important to have both parts of the solution. It's really about being able to offset and absorb the carbon equivalent that is or carbon dioxide equivalent that's being released into the atmosphere, and making those changes in our processes and in our supply chains and across our value sheds that are going to actually reduce and prevent and avoid the emissions of greenhouse causing gases. All of those are part of a very important solution. It's not either or, it's really a and.
But there is in some ways an order of operations here. It's important as an organization that's making a climate commitment to first examine one's own operations and one's own supply chain and figure out, are there ways that we can reduce our footprint, directly, right? Can we work on procuring a more efficient fleet of cars to deliver our products? Is it, can we procure, renewable energy as part of our scope 2 emissions? And then finally, for scope 3, are there ways that we can work with our suppliers, the growers that are growing the grain that go into the crackers that we put into the market, to work with them to reduce their footprint, right? And so I think that there's a growing recognition that insetting or sort of scope 3 emissions management is extremely important, and maybe even the first thing that you should try and do. And if there's no additional opportunity, if you've exhausted your sort of financially feasible options for reducing emissions within your scope 1 and 2 and 3, then go outside of that scope and offset the rest.
Right.
It's important to look at all options, as you mentioned. But that's sort of how I think about the differences here of a carbon offset versus a carbon inset. And there is a lot of conversation about both right now.
And so and before we get into scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, because that's a really interesting topic for demystification here. But before we get into that, right, when we talk about what is a carbon credit, you had said before, right, a carbon credit is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that is sequestered or avoided. And what that means for regenerative agriculture, for carbon farming, is that 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is reduced or avoided or sequestered, is going to come from the actual processes and practices of farming. One of those practices and processes is the actual growth of plants, right? As plants grow, they consume and metabolize carbon dioxide, and they can store it in their root structure and in the soil down below. That's one piece. Some other pieces are doing things like conservation tillage, right? When growers are running their tractors and their machinery over the fields, churning up that soil with a conventional till will release carbon dioxide, anything that's stored in that soil up into the atmosphere. A conservation tillage does less of that, and a no-till approach does no churning of that soil. And so all of those sorts of practices, and there are many other practices, help to reduce, avoid, and sequester carbon dioxide through the course of those farming practices. And when we talk about regenerative agriculture, when we use that term, those practices that reduce, avoid, and sequester carbon dioxide in the soil also have a really big benefit to the soil health, the biome itself as well. And those improvements, those practices actually improve the soil. They can enrich the soil that's there. They can actually help to grow the amount of topsoil, rich topsoil that is present. It reduces erosion. It reduces, leaching and flow of inputs, chemical inputs, and fertilizers and things like that off into the watershed. And ultimately, what regenerative agriculture does for the grower is to create healthier soils, create more climate resilient crops. It actually has a measurable impact, a positive impact on yield for the crops that are being grown. Overall, it helps create a better agricultural product. And it has all of these climate benefits as well, which is why when we talk about, SIBO's mission is to scale regenerative agriculture, it's really this win-win situation for the grower. You're improving the soil, you're improving the yield, you're making healthier, more nutrient-dense products, and reducing input costs in many cases, and potentially creating a new revenue stream through carbon farming by being able to quantify and then ultimately produce and sell carbon credits as another commodity.
And yet, I would just point out that these practices are still not widely adopted within the space. You're right, there are all of these stacked benefits, but on their own, they haven't demonstrated enough value or enough sort of financial incentive to really propel wide-scale adoption of cover cropping and reduced tillage and reduced nitrogen. So, there is something locking up this transition. I think that we will eventually see it. I hope that we will. But, that's why something like a carbon market is so important. Right. And, that's, ultimately the additionality that we need to show to demonstrate that a carbon credit is valid is essentially that exactly, right? Which is that we're providing value that is ultimately inspiring the grower to make the change. If those other stacked benefits, all the things that you just mentioned, Billy, reduce input costs, et cetera, aren't enough on their own, well, then we need something else. And that's really what these carbon credits are for. So even though they're getting value, it hasn't been enough. Only something like 5% of growers at this point in the US are doing cover crops. We need that number to be way higher. And so I think because of that, we're able to show that additionality does exist here. And just what you're seeing on the screen is just that, these are sort of four of the key kind of components of a carbon credit. You need to demonstrate that these exist in order for a credit to be valid. Additionality is the idea that it would not have happened otherwise, right? And some of the important kind of pieces to look at as it relates to regenerative agriculture is, was this practice already adopted in the past? So typically with the different carbon registries, they require that it is a net new practice this year. And that's the reason why, is because we need to show that they haven't done it otherwise. They didn't already do it because they saw the incentives were already on the table for them. They also have to show, is this a common practice already? Is everyone already doing this? There are certain sort of regenerative practices that most of the market has already adopted, right? I think that something like 70% of growers at this point are doing some type of reduced tillage typically. And so it's hard to demonstrate that we should be able to provide, financial resources for something that, most people are already doing. So really it's, additionality is all about what is the reason that this practice is happening, and can we show that the carbon credit had a material impact on its adoption? A couple others to mention is permanence. We need to be able to show that this carbon credit is a permanent impact, right? It's not just a temporary thing. We need to show that there is a long-term lasting impact from the storage. And so that's where a lot of the uncertainty comes in as it relates to soil carbon and to these marketplaces, is that it's hard to prove that a new practice regime will yield an absolutely permanent a drawdown of carbon that will be stored in soil forever. It's not as if you're creating a rock and putting it on a scale and then putting it on your desk or something like that. And so that's why there's all sorts of different components built into our, the different registries that require that we evaluate, what sort of opportunity costs are there for a grower? If the price of corn goes way up, what's the likelihood that they're going to change their practices back? What sort of environmental factors are there? If there's a major drought, does that have an impact on soil carbon? We have to evaluate that. Buffer pools, investing schedules, how much of the credit do we just withhold in perpetuity to ensure that if there is a reversal and that carbon gets re-released back into the atmosphere, that we're accounting for that. And then vesting schedules, right? We want to create an incentive schedule or an incentive structure that has the grower that continues to do these practices year in and year out and will continue to reap the rewards. A couple others to mention: leakage. Did the reduction here cause an increase there? Is it truly net negative, or did the adoption of these practices over here just yield some other practice on a different part of their land to account for maybe a yield hit or something like that? Is it a reduction or is it a reallocation? Any comments on that stuff, Billy?
Yeah, I would just say that this is where the agricultural markets really have an opportunity to shine, and where SIBO is taking a really innovative and thought leadership approach here as we talk to the market, as we talk to growers, as we talk to companies, as we talk to legislators and regulators and bureaucrats, and we're having all those conversations, because things like additionality in the energy markets, which a lot of the early carbon markets were designed for, and with those in mind, additionality in those markets is really not able to be applied equally to agriculture. Agriculture is inherently an annual seasonal activity. In some cases, the additionality is happening at some level every single year, because every single year a brand new decision is made about what to plant, how to plant. The prevalence of renting fields in some way, shape, or form means that there's a lot of ownership changes. And so while the field is the same field, or the parcel is the same parcel, the practices on that parcel have to be evaluated every single year. And so that's where the agriculture carbon markets and the regenerative ag-based markets really have an opportunity to shine and to take a leadership stance. That's what SIBO Technologies is doing. We're doing that in partnership with the with the programs and the protocols like you had mentioned before, like Vera and Gold Standard and CAR, and with some of the other players in this space as well. And I think it's a good point now to ask one of the questions that's coming from one of our viewers about what is the average cost and value of a carbon credit right now, and this is I think this speaks directly, Steve, to your point about, hey, there's a cost of doing regenerative ag, or of doing practices that can help to offset and sequester and reduce and avoid carbon emissions. What is that price? Do you want to talk to that? I've got a chart pulled up on my other computer over here that we could talk to if you want to as well.
Sure. I mean, if you want to bring that up, please do, and I can speak a little bit to it while you do that. It's a really important question that was asked, and I think we have to understand that the adoption of these practices are not cheap, especially when you're doing it for the first time, right? So, there are costs of equipment, there are costs of, cover crop seeds, there are the costs of potentially taking a hit to your yield if you don't completely optimize it in the first couple of years. Typically that normalizes after a couple of years, but in the first few, you got to figure out exactly what the best kind of cover crop mix and sort of practice regime is in order to optimize for your land. And so we've seen upwards of costs of north of $50 per acre. The typical average cost of a carbon credit in sort of our voluntary markets here in the US is less than $10. So we're talking probably about $7.50, somewhere in that range. Those are higher in regulated markets. We've seen upwards of somewhere around $25. And the prices, I should mention, are steadily rising. And that's an average as well across all of the different types of carbon credit out there. So you can have a carbon credit that's generated from putting a scrubber on a smokestack and kind of making sure that carbon doesn't get released into the atmosphere. That those are very cheap, right? Those cost probably $2 or $3 per ton. And then there are really expensive credits like direct air capture, which costs sometimes upwards of $150 to $200 a ton. And then regenerative agriculture, thus far within the voluntary space, has been a relatively expensive, compared to the norms within the industry, credit of about $15 to $20 we've seen so far. And again, this is on its way up. But we at SIBO really believe that if we're going to be, inspiring full change or broad changes within this space of adoption of regenerative practices, that we need to get closer to covering all of those costs. And it doesn't have to be completely from the carbon credit. There are opportunities to stack incentives either from government programs or from other sort of environmental marketplaces. But we need to aim through all of those to get to a point where ultimately we cover all of the practice. Otherwise, it will be niche. It will be along the margins where we see adoption. So I think that we ultimately we need to get to a point where we are paying not just $50 a credit. But remember that an acre of land only generates probably about typically a half a credit, sometimes more. Sometimes it's over a full ton per acre, but typically on average it's about a half. So if you're paying $20, for example, for a ton, and then you divide that by 2, that on a per acre basis, that's only about $10. So we need the prices of this carbon to go up considerably if we want to get close to paying for all of it.
Yeah, and as you can see, this is just a quick Google search here that was done, just looking at a normalized carbon price index over time. And again, this is not for regenerative or farm-based carbon prices, but it's kind of overall. It goes up to about mid-year last year. So you can see that interest in carbon is going up, and the price index is hovering right there around $20 today. On the SIBO technology platform, you can buy a SIBO verified carbon credit for about $20 a credit. But again, it's very well recognized that when it comes to regenerative agriculture, there is like you said, Steve, there's a cost to actually implementing those practices. There's a cost to doing cover crops. There's a cost to doing no-till, right? It requires a new sort of, drill planter, when it comes to time to actually plant the cash crop. There are potential cost savings on things like reduced nitrogen inputs when you're growing corn. But there's all these other kind of costs to navigate. I know the USDA has now issued I believe it's a $5 kind of coupon for crop insurance for people who are doing cover cropping. So there's kind of all these kind of stacked or overlapping incentives, not necessarily cash payments to the grower or to the landowner. But this is where a lot of the uncertainty lies, and that's why we're having a session like this to help to demystify this as much as we can, because it's always changing right now. But I think that your the kind of general rule there, right? Average cost or value of a carbon credit. You can find them cheap, you can find them expensive, and really what needs to happen in SIBO's view, and in the view of a lot of other people as well, is that the cost of a carbon credit, or the price of a carbon credit, needs to be enough to actually create that financial incentive for growers to implement those practices. At the end of the day, farming is a business. It is a family business. It is a big business, and they have to be able to to make ends meet and hopefully make a profit and grow and expand literally their operations. And if we're asking not just to maximize yield and at current commodity prices, but also to take into consideration soil regeneration and climate health, having those incentives in place through the vehicle of a carbon credit, I think makes a lot of sense.
Agreed. I also think it's worth pointing out that, from a demand perspective, from the buyers of these credits are not created equal, right? There's a reason why some of this carbon is more expensive. And, as it relates to regenerative agriculture, this is we call it charismatic carbon, right? There's a beautiful story to tell about the impacts this is having beyond the carbon that you're sucking out of the atmosphere, right? I mean, the impact it has on soil health, on fortifying our food system, on creating new revenue streams for growers, on creating a pollinator habitats, right? There are all sorts of different really valuable things that happen as a result of regenerative agriculture that a buyer of that carbon would want to talk about. If you're going to be offsetting your footprint, you should have a portfolio of different approaches, and
right.
Particularly if you operate within the food and agriculture space, purchasing carbon credits from through regenerative agriculture is absolutely crucial to telling a story that's relevant to your business.
Well, let's go ahead and talk briefly about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and then wrap up on what is carbon farming and regenerative ag.
Sure. So, I mean, if you look at when we talk about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, this is sort of the emission profile of an organization. And so, we define these through these different scopes. Scope 1 is direct. So these are things that are kind of owned and operated by the company. That's, company facilities, company vehicles that are owned, a fleet of delivery vehicles, whatever. If they're owned by the company, they qualify as scope 1. Scope 2 is typically defined by procured energy. So, the energy required to run your manufacturing lines or your data centers or whatever else you do, you do have some control over it. And that's why you'll see a lot of, PPAs or power purchase agreements where, big tech companies are going out and securing energy from a particular, wind farm or from a solar farm. And so that's scope 2. Those are two things that, typically as in terms of order of operations, a lot of companies start with trying to do as much as they can within scope 1 and scope 2. And then oftentimes scope 3 comes next. It's a little harder with scope 3 because you don't have as much direct control, but scope 3 is everything else. And scope 3 is both they're both upstream and downstream. So these are things that, would be a result of, for example, if you are a CPG company that creates crackers, one of your upstream activities would be the production of the grain that goes into your crackers, right? So that both the on-farm activities, the transportation to get it to the processor, the processing itself, and then finally the delivery to you. And then downstream activities within the scope 3 context involve the use of your product and service. So, once it gets into the hands of the consumer, how are they using it? Do you have any control over that, right? Or can you put your product into packaging that, is more recyclable, right? And so these are all things that as a company, you should theoretically have some control over to varying degrees, obviously. And those that you don't have any control, at that point, that's when offsets come into play to, further influence your overall footprint.
Well, that was really helpful, Steve. And when we talk about insets and offsets, right? Those insets can be through scopes 1, 2, and 3, and the offsets are things that you can buy from anywhere. It's that sponge helping to clean up the overflowing bathtub. but when we talk, and when we talk about, SIBO and what our company does, what we are in the business of, we are a technology platform company focused on scaling regenerative agriculture. And when we talk about scaling regenerative agriculture, one of the things that makes the most business sense are insets, offsets, and incentives for regenerative agriculture. And when you're talking about an organization, SIBO Technologies sells a technology platform that helps companies with ag somewhere in their supply chain or in their value shed manage, monitor, and incentivize, and ultimately monetize their agricultural network, or their agricultural systems that are maybe part of their Scope 3 emissions profile. That means, in your example, Steve, of the CPG, of the company producing crackers, or a company creating a soy-based alternative protein, for example, they can see and create incentives for their growers, who are all independent, right? These aren't controlled, compellable growers, but they can create an incentive structure and then monitor what's actually going on those farms and on those fields in the way of farming practices, like tillage, like cover cropping, like reduced inputs. And SIBO allows that verification at scale of those regenerative agricultural practices, which not only improve the soil and the end agricultural product, but also have this net benefit of a carbon credit that can be produced and then ultimately sold. As part of that, SIBO also has a carbon marketplace, a voluntary carbon marketplace, like we talked about at the very beginning. When we combine our land insights with the farmers who enroll, there's never any charge for a farmer who enrolls in our platform to actually create and monitor their practices, and then ultimately produce that SIBO verified carbon credit, or SIBO regenerative unit, which can then be bought and sold for about $20 today, and those proceeds go back to the farmer, less a management cost, that price that comes back to SIBO, if and when they're sold. And you brought this up. That's terrific. So I saw that there was a question about what is SIBO actually in the business of, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about that. But let's briefly go. I know that we've been at this for about an hour, but let's talk about carbon farming, and let's get into what is carbon farming and where does SIBO play there. Steve, why don't you take that one?
Sure. So I think what's important to point out here is that we see carbon markets as a mean to an end, right? We see this as our focus as a company, as you mentioned, Billy, is to scale regenerative agriculture. And for decades, we've been asking growers to deliver increasingly cheap, reliable, plentiful food, and by and large, they've delivered, right? So food is cheap and available, and right now we're asking them to change and reprioritize sort of how they go about making a living and operating within that ecosystem. And I don't think it's right, really, for us to sort of point the finger and blame them for any of the environmental impact here. They're running a business, and ultimately we need to support this transition as if we as a society value the impacts of doing things differently. And so I think that's kind of the underlying sort of reality that we as SIBO have recognized. And that's really, if we want to scale regenerative agriculture, we need to use these different mechanisms to help sustain it and support it. And so we see carbon markets as one way to do that. We see incentives, as another way, where it's, either through a particular stakeholder that wants to offer, discounted products, or if they want to, procure regenerative grain, or sponsor other ecosystem services like water, water quality. And so, that's sort of, where we are in terms of, really trying to put together the value proposition to help growers make this change. And so, this is kind of what we've built so far as SIBO, and sort of how we've envisioned one of these many workflows that we'll continue to build out, which is, a grower would enroll in SIBO's carbon market. Right. So they would give some information, they would attest to doing certain practices, both in the past and moving forward. And they would commit to doing it for a certain period of time. We at SIBO believe that it's important to allow for growers to make an annual commitment, as well as longer commitments if you're able and willing to do so. Most growers are renting land, and it's really difficult to make a 10-year commitment to doing the same practices each and every year if you don't know you're going to be operating on that land next year or in a couple of years down the line. So, once a grower has enrolled, then SIBO's technology will automatically monitor and verify practices. So we use remote sensing technology and satellite imagery to look at, individual fields and see if a cover crop emerges and to determine what sort of tillage was taking place. SIBO's models, the SALIS model, then quantifies the carbon impact of that, updated practice regime and validated practice regime. And then a third party would validate, that everything that we've done is correct and that the model that we're using is correct. And in some cases, they will go out and actually do soil samples on the ground. And then that is when the credit actually gets registered. At SIBO, we have our own sort of marketplace where we can register credits, but we're also working with third-party registries, to expand the types of buyers that will be interested.
Yeah.
Finally, once those credits are available, then and they sell, then the grower will get paid. So that's sort of the dynamic of how a grower who's adopting these new practices would see revenue as a result of them.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic, Steve. I will point out to the listening and the viewing audience that right now SIBO is focused on row crops, right, and your kind of your main row crops in the U.S. So that's going to be corn, soy, cotton, and wheat, along with cover crop detection and validation. Our technology allows us to scale the verification, quantification, and monitoring of fields across the United States because of our satellite and computer vision approach, and then our modeling based approach, which is baselined with actual on field data and soil sampling. But the ability to scale this across all millions of parcels in the United States is absolutely vital in order for regenerative agriculture and ultimately carbon farming as a climate solution to take off. We don't believe that we should wait and do nothing until the perfect solution is found, because the pace of technological innovation means that the perfect solution will always be what is current right here today, and it will always be improving. And so that is our commitment to technological innovation, as well as making an impact right now, and helping businesses monitor and verify and improve their supply chain and their value shed, as well as individual growers and individual consumers to make a difference right in their in their neighborhoods and in their backyard. So I know we are over time. There's a bunch of questions rolling in right now. We will answer these on our blog. But Steve, I wanted to leave you with just a couple questions that came in here. Do we have an idea of what kind of cropping systems provide the most credit potential, like row crops, fruit trees, vegetables, and grazing and pasture land? Right now I said SIBO is focused on the row crops, and I think there's different impacts for different cropping systems.
Well, that's a really good question. And I think that there's still a lot to be learned. We've heard a lot of really interesting new research within the pasture land space of different types of grazing techniques, intensive rotational grazing and things like that, and how it can rapidly, bring back topsoil. I think that the key for SIBO is that we rely currently on cropping systems that we can use, satellite imagery and remote sensing to validate, to verify.
Yep.
And so, it's important for us to be able to use satellite imagery to determine whether the practices that we're crediting for have actually happened, right? All of that ends up as an input into our model. And for anything that we can't, use satellite imagery for, would require sort of attestation as well as, receipts, right? For example, for nitrogen purchases, or, as applied maps coming directly off of a farm management system. So we need to be able to verify it. And it's key that these things are scalable so that we can drive as much of that value back to growers as possible. As far as, the different practices themselves within, row crop system, typically we see that the biggest impact comes when there is a stacking of practices, or
right,
happening together. So, no-till alongside cover crop, alongside, a reduction in nitrogen. That's when you have major results, as well as
along with crop rotation as well. Yep. Right? Crop rotation is really important. I know that we've just recently found that as a very large statistical driver of carbon sequestration.
That's right, and frankly, it's also a matter of the delta from what you were doing before, right? If you're using a conventional system with no rotation and a ton of fertilizer and no cover crops, et cetera, then that delta is going to yield a big credit. So there's another question around baselines. Within the typical registries and those systems through Vera and CAR, the way that works is that you look at the previous 3 years at a minimum of what practices were, and then compare that to the updated practice regime to determine what the credit eligibility looks like.
Right. And we also believe that growers who have been doing the right thing for regenerative practices and for the environment, who have been doing that for years and years, and in some cases even generations, that they ought not be bracketed out from the entire marketplace, but that they have a place